Our journey through the book of Ecclesiastes. And as I've mentioned before, as we've made our way through this series, we've done some things that are a little bit unusual for us here at Friendship Community Church as we made our way through this particular series. One of them is that we've been tackling this book 2 chapters per week, where we usually do just a chapter or even a portion of a chapter. And part of that is because as wisdom literature, it's very helpful for us to sort of hear it as it would have been taught. But at the same time, I acknowledge that this is a little like drinking from a fire hydrant sometimes, and there's just no way that we can focus in depth on every phrase when we do it this way. So that's part of the trade-off. But I also acknowledge that part of what's just unusual with this is that it's such a cultural expression of ancient wisdom that it's difficult at times for us to wrap our minds around it. And we have to make a significant point at times to make sure we use the lens of all of Scripture and the help of the Holy Spirit to guide us in understanding these words that at times are rough around the edges or even seem somewhat contradictory at times. All that said, Ecclesiastes is really a gift to us. Like the Psalms of lament that invite us into a fuller faith, Ecclesiastes challenges us to not just have a light, fluffy faith that gets us through the good times, but to have a weightier, deep faith that will help sustain us through the storms. In their explanation of Ecclesiastes, the scholars Bill T. Arnold and Brian B. Bayer explain the inclusion of Ecclesiastes this way: the very presence of a book like Ecclesiastes in the biblical canon is evidence that our faith welcomes closer scrutiny. This book acknowledges the fact that the circumstances of life sometimes make faith difficult, but its inclusion among the wisdom books of the Old Testament teaches that questions and even doubts need to be grappled with honestly. Over time, such honest grappling stretches our faith and leads to deeper faith commitments. These words aren't all easy to hear, but they are good in that they challenge us to grow. So part of what we'll read today includes, in the closing remarks, the teacher saying that they chose their words very carefully to have just the right words. And if you've read all of Ecclesiastes before, or if you've been with us throughout this series, you might hear that and be shocked and think, really? Those really dark phrases were just the right words? Really? Those times where it seemed like in chapter 3 you contradicted yourself in chapter 7, that was just the right words? How can that be? But the point of this wisdom is not to teach us something that's just easy to hear. It wasn't to just tickle audiences into false senses of joy. Ecclesiastes is not some campaign speech carefully crafted so that everyone in the audience will get warm, fuzzy feelings for the candidate at one point in time or another. It is just and true words. Words that give an honest appraisal of life in a broken world. Its intention wasn't just to make us feel good. Its intention is to give us useful wisdom for living an upright, godly life in a world where everything is not all right. Now, in some of that content, before those closing remarks, we're going to see things we've heard before if you've been here. It's almost as though the teacher is saying one last time, in case you didn't get it, I'll expand on some things a little more so you get it. And then the teacher, at the very end of the body, repeats where he began. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. The teacher has gone full circle, reflected on all that is observable in this life, which he refers to as life under the sun. He's given all kinds of wisdom and proverbs and sayings for living a better life. And at the end, he's saying, if all you do is stuff you can measure with your senses, it's just a passing vapor. There are many uncertainties in this life, but we must keep journeying through it. Part again of the whole point in the verses we're about to read is that we must keep journeying through it. It is not an option to just stop and stay put. Yes, life has uncertainty, but wisdom allows us to make the most of it as we travel the life God has given us. With that said, let's read these final chapters of Ecclesiastes, chapters 11 and 12. It's on page 705 in the provided Bibles, and you can use the screens to follow along as well. It says this: "Ship your grain across the sea. After many days you may receive a return. Invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8. You do not know what disaster may come upon the land. If clouds are full of water, they pour rain on the earth. Whether a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where it falls, there it will lie. Whoever watches the wind will not plant. Whoever looks at the clouds will never reap. As you do not know the path of the wind or how the body is formed in a mother's womb, so you cannot understand the work of God, the maker of all things. Sow your seed in the morning, and at evening let your hands not be idle, for you do not know which will succeed, whether this or that, or whether both will do equally well. Light is sweet, and it pleases the eyes to see the sun. However many years anyone may live, let them enjoy them all. But let them remember the days of darkness, for there will be many. Everything to come is meaningless. You who are young, be happy while you are young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see. But know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. So then, banish anxiety from your heart and cast off the troubles of your body, for youth and vigor are meaningless. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark, and the clouds return after the rain. When the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those looking through the windows grow dim. When the doors to the street are closed and the sound of grinding fades. When people rise at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint. When people are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets. When the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags itself along and desire no longer is stirred. Then people go to their eternal home and mourners go about the streets. Remember him before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring and the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. Not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. The words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails, given by one shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. That concludes our reading of Ecclesiastes. The Renaissance artist Michelangelo is credited with having said, "The greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark." There is risk in setting off with a plan to do something grand. There is risk of making very large goals that we may not be able to complete the entirety of the goal and achieve only a portion of them. But even if we achieve only a portion of our large goal, we will still have accomplished more than the person who made no goal and covered no ground at all. One of the ways you may think about this that may hit home for many of us is thinking about New Year's resolutions, whether you've chosen to make them or not. It's a known thing that most people give up on them by about the middle of January, and that by this time in February, it's something like 3 to 5% that are actually still working on it. So it's easy to get cynical about it. But if you're somebody who made a goal and you started investing in your health, even if you've slightly modified your trajectory of health before giving up on that goal, you're still better off than the person who failed the minute they thought about making a goal and didn't make one at all. As the teacher builds up to this final call to enjoy the life God has given and to face death, he challenges us to consider whether we will move forward and how. And he challenges us to think about life from one more angle. He's already said back in chapter 3 that God makes everything beautiful in its time, and that we often get the timing wrong, and that's why things aren't always so beautiful for us. He said there's a lot of divine mystery, and he uses some images here to tell us that it's mysterious that God can take 2 half cells and make a whole person with unique character traits. It's mysterious the way the wind carves paths and that we can't control it. We cannot fully comprehend exactly with precision which way a tree is going to fall by the power of the wind. And in those days before machinery, that was a really big deal, because if a really big tree fell, you just had to work around it or work really hard for a really long time on it. Now, with all the development of science, we have some control, some knowledge of these things, but even so, we do not fully control them. Just think about how often the weather app is actually right more than a day or two out with precision. There are so many things we cannot control. So much in life is beyond our control. But it would be foolish to say, well, I'm going to wait until conditions are perfect and I know with full certainty I'll have success with my next step before we made a goal. The foolish person in this broken world says that they're going to wait until everything is exactly perfect before they take the next step. Because in a broken world, we have to acknowledge there are some risks. And if we wait for everything to be exactly perfect, we'll just keep waiting and never take the next step. And so, in response to the earlier call to make the most out of our work, we are challenged also to make the most out of our investments, both commercial and how we invest our lives. And we're told to use wisdom, to take calculated risks. Not to take no risks, and not to take totally carefree risks, calculated risks. So the teacher is saying, yes, the world is broken. Some things you try will succeed, some things will fail. But you'll make the most out of the life God has given you if you live deeply, work hard, and try your hand at multiple things to see what God will bless the most. In the very first words here of this beginning of chapter 11, there are some words that are chosen differently depending on which English translation you look at. And they're both right. I read, ship your grain across the sea. An equally valid way to say that same Hebrew phrase in English is cast your bread upon the waters. But the two phrases are sort of like two sides of the same coin. They have slightly different emphasis. To cast your bread upon the waters would have been heard as a call to generosity. It would have been heard as a call to make sure that you took care of the people around you. The idea being that if you are a generous person, the community you are working on, the community you are developing, will be blessed with strengthening relationships, deeper bonds, and your generosity will help the people around you to be more stable. And then if something happens in your future outside of your control, your community is more ready to help you. Generosity is a form of a safety net in that way. Now, the other phrase that is equally valid, to ship your grain out across the sea, that's more about commerce. It's about making sure that you do strategic commercial things with your resources. Either way, it's about using resources in light of the fact that the future is uncertain. If it's about shipping your grain specifically across the sea, it's a way of saying take great risks that are calculated. Because sending any resource across the sea was one of the riskiest forms of commerce in that time of history. It was also very, very lucrative when it did succeed. That said, only a fool would ship all their grain in one ship because of the high level of risk. A few verses before this, the end of the previous chapter is likely the origin of talking about secrets and saying, "A little birdie told me so." These verses are likely the origin of the saying, "Don't put all your eggs in one basket." You would want to send your grain in numerous ships, because if one hits a rock and sinks, if one gets overtaken by pirates, you don't want everything in it. But if you send out your grain in various ventures, even if one or two fails, you'll still likely have a very good return. Either way, the terrible thing to do is do nothing with the resources God has given. Earlier in this book, it was stressed that we don't put our identity in our resources because they are uncertain. And here it's saying we don't put our identity in our resources. It's not disagreeing with that, but it is saying it would be terrible to do nothing with them. In the last message we saw, we are supposed to work hard at whatever God gives us to work at. And here we're told your work isn't all going to succeed, but work hard at it anyways. Don't let yourself stop setting goals. Keep setting goals. Keep going after what God calls you to with all your heart. And then the teacher draws our attention from that advice about commerce back to the bigger picture he's had in mind off and on throughout this whole book. The challenge to enjoy life. Here he specifically challenges starting to enjoy life early while we're young. And if you've read the rest of the book or been here throughout the series, you know he really, really wants us to know that life is uncertain, but we should enjoy it anyways. He's previously challenged people to enjoy life by enjoying eating and drinking. That came up in chapter 2, 3, 5, 8, and 9. Again and again. Make sure that you enjoy God's good gift of food and drink. Have fantastic meals with people close to you. In chapter 9, he challenged us to enjoy good clothes and companionship, especially the marriage God gives us if he gives us one that we can grow and thrive in. And he also has said to find satisfaction in our work in chapter 2, 3, and 5. He challenges us to enjoy life in all of its different facets. And he says here, start young. Get rid of anxiety while you are young. Pursue your passions. Make goals that are good and give you joy. But this isn't a license to sin. Do grand things. Make big goals. Do go on joyous adventures, but know that God is witness to and judge of all of it. The authors of the Net Bible First Edition notes said it this way: as you follow your impulses and desires, realize that all you think and do will eventually be evaluated by God. So one must seek joy within the boundaries of God's moral standards. And Charles Spurgeon, who was a famous English preacher about 100 years ago, he said, "Youthful sins lay a foundation for aged sorrows." Whatever age we are, now is a time to shed anxiety, to not just wait to pursue the use of God's good gifts. But we also need to do so embracing God's guidance, surrendering, as we talked about earlier in this service. Because in our later years, we will already have hard things as we get closer to death. But our later years are harder yet if we have a heavy soul for having chosen to build our life in a way opposed to God's guidance. And to help stress that knowledge of how what we do as we're young and whether we live with wisdom throughout or not makes a difference, and how much it's already hard at the end anyways, the teacher uses overlapping images of how hard the final years before death can be. He represents this with a house, representing the life we build from that foundation up. And how as we get older, life starts to feel like it falls into disrepair, and we feel it in our bodies. So the teacher, who has commonly talked about life on earth, life under the sun, begins talking about lights and how clouds and storms come. And that there is a final storm we all experience where we don't see the sun of this life anymore, and that is death. And for many who live long, as that gets closer, the light starts to fade. And just quickly, to help you wrap your mind around this ancient teaching of the struggles of old age, we see time after time, these overlapping images of a body and a house directly relate to real life, what we go through. Just quickly, here's a few of them. The keepers of the house begin to tremble. Almost all of us have to use our hands in one way or another to work or to maintain our homes and things. And almost all of us, if God gives us enough years that we live to old age, will have a time where we can't hold them still. The keepers of the house end up starting to tremble. The strong men stoop. Could be two different things. Our legs are some of the strongest muscle groups in our entire body, and many people struggle to walk in their old age. But also it could be a symbol of our back and our core, where almost all people who live a long life start to get curled over as the body starts to give out. The grinders cease because they are few. This one's one of the most obvious ones. Almost no one makes it to the end with all their teeth intact. Those looking through the window grow dim. Our eyes are like windows to the world outside of ourselves. And almost all of us as we age, some of us from a very young age, but almost all of us as we age end up having degradation of our eyes, and we gradually lose our sight. The doors to the street close. Given where we are in the face and in the progress, it's likely the nose he's talking about here, that it's more regularly clogged or ceases to smell correctly. And especially if you think about an ancient village with markets out in the street and fresh breads going by in the morning, flowers and fruits and vegetables, you would want to swing your door open and let all those wonderful smells in and let the musky air of the night out. But as we age, the ability to enjoy those sweet smells starts to fade. And sound becomes a double-edged sword, because the slightest sound ruins sleep, but the sweetest sounds start getting harder to hear. And then he mentions the almond tree blossom, and that one means more to me now than it did having grown up in Iowa, because I lived in California for a while. And just like areas around Iowa have tulip festivals and things, in Central Valley, California, they have the Almond Blossom Festival. They say almond wrong. They would say they say it right. But the Almond Blossom Festival is when they celebrate the time of year when the trees all turn white